You can't get away from yourself by moving from one place to another. Ernest Hemingway, The Sun Also Rises. The Ernest Hemingway House on the island of Key West is a 1.5-acre property. It sits across from the Key West Lighthouse, and it, along with its polydactyl cats, is Key West's most famous attraction. The French colonial-style home was built in 1851 by resident Asa Tift, a wealthy marine and salvage wrecker. Ernest Hemingway and his second wife Pauline Pfeiffer moved to Key West in 1928, and 3 years later, Pauline convinced her uncle to purchase the house for them as a wedding gift for the grand amount of $8,000. They restored the entire house and converted the second story of the carriage house into a writing studio for Ernest. The original 18th century dining room table and buffet remain in the home, as well as handcrafted Murano glass chandeliers, because Pauline felt that ceiling fans were tacky. There are 2 fireplaces, one in the dining room and one in the nanny's room, despite the fact that it never really gets cold enough to use them. The portrait that hangs over the fireplace in the dining room is what Hemingway looked like when he lived in the house. Hemingway fathered 3 boys. They all lived in the house at one point. His oldest is John Hemingway, born to his first wife Hadley. He is the father of actresses Muriel and Margot Hemingway. Patrick and Gregory were both born to his second wife Pauline. On the property are polydactyl cats. The first cat was given to Hemingway by a sea captain from Massachusetts. 6-toed cats were considered by sailors to be good luck. And now there are 54 cats on the property, all descendants of Hemingway's original cats, and all have 6 to 7 toes. They are all named after famous people because Hemingway thought it was funny to introduce the famous cats to guests. The nanny's room upstairs is decorated in a 1930s Art Deco style. In the room now is a picture that is an omen to Hemingway's drinking habits. After a night of heavy drinking in Paris, he had gone to use the restroom. In those days, the toilets had the tanks high on the top, and as he pulled what he thought was the chain to the toilet, something came crashing down on his head. Turns out, it was the chain to a skylight that cut open his head, and a long line of stitches followed. In what used to be the children's room, now stands a collection of Hemingway's works and pictures from hunting trips. A farewell to arms is displayed in the room, which is based on Hemingway's experience in World War I. He was an ambulance driver during World War I for the Red Cross near the Italian front. One day, as he was delivering chocolate and cigarette rations near the front lines to boost morale, a mortar shell struck the area, and Hemingway was rushed to the hospital. He had 200 pieces of shrapnel pulled from his body, and his right knee had to be completely rebuilt, leaving the 19-year-old Hemingway bedridden for months. He fell in love with his nurse Agnes and wanted to marry her, but she was already engaged to someone else. The pictures of his very first safari hang on the walls, and he wrote The Green Hills of Africa while he lived in the house. In 1933, his first safari cost $25,000, $500,000 in today's money. He hired the same safari guide that Teddy Roosevelt had. The trip was paid for by Pauline's rich Uncle Gus, who owned a chemical company that eventually became a pharmaceutical company that was bought out eventually by Pfizer, and he also founded Max Factor. In the Hemingway bedroom, the headboard of their bed is a gate from a monastery in Spain that Pauline fell in love with and had shipped home to use as the headboard. The room also contains a painting of the property created by Henry Faulkner of Lexington, Kentucky. Hemingway collected chairs, and by their bed you will see 2 Spanish birthing chairs. He also used these on his hunting expeditions. There are doors from the bedroom that lead out to the veranda, where you can look across the way to the carriage house where Hemingway's typewriter and his collection of books remain. His typewriter is still on the desk he used in the house for 9 years. and also used as a war correspondent during World War II. The first novel that he wrote on the property was Death in the Afternoon, and the last novel he completed in the carriage house was his favorite novel, For Whom the Bell Tolls. He also wrote many short stories there too. Hemingway did his best to write in the morning and be done by around 2 p.m. He had a saying, "Write drunk and edit sober." On the other side of the veranda that looks toward the lighthouse, a scene from Timothy Dalton's James Bond movie was filmed there. As Dalton jumps from the second-story veranda to evade a sniper for the lighthouse, he exclaims, "I guess this is a farewell to arms," a nod to the property's most famous resident. Downstairs, as you head to the pool, is a drinking fountain used by the Hemingway cats. The bottom portion of the fountain is a long urinal that Hemingway pulled from his favorite local bar, Sloppy Joe's. The story goes that one night, in a drunken fit, he stumbled out of the bathroom and said to Joe, "You know, Joe, I figure I've dumped enough money down that drain. I'm taking it home." He convinced a couple of buddies to help him rip it from the wall and drag it through the streets of Key West until they got it to his house. Pauline, the fashion writer from Paris, wanted nothing to do with a urinal in her yard, so she quickly had it disguised with Spanish tiles and imported an enormous olive oil jar from Cuba, where she had the whole thing turned into a fountain. Not far from that urinal is the very large pool Pauline had installed on the property. The pool on the property did not always exist. At one time, Hemingway had his very own full-size regulated boxing ring on the site of the pool. He would host and participate in boxing events on the property. When he went overseas to cover the Spanish Civil War as a correspondent with other reporters that included Martha Gellhorn, Pauline back home began to hear stories about how Martha and Ernest were carrying on an affair. Pauline was so upset, she destroyed the boxing ring, and in 1937, she spent $20,000 to replace it with a pool. It was the only pool in all of the Keys during Hemingway's time on the island, and it is still the largest private pool in existence on the island. When Hemingway returned and found out Pauline destroyed his boxing ring and spent $20,000, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a 1937 penny, and threw it on the ground, exclaiming, "You might as well have my last red cent," and then stormed off to Sloppy Joe's. Pauline took the penny and enshrined it in the bricks by the $20,000 pool. She was awarded the house in their divorce and would happily take her guests to see the penny. She never married again and remained in the house until she died in 1951. She willed the house back to Hemingway. When he passed in 1961, his sons sold the estate to Bernice Dixon for $80,000, who created the museum 4 years later. That family still owns the property to this day.